ever tried to buy something online, from another country? You find like the perfect thing, maybe some really nice Italian leather shoes, and you're all ready to just hit like add to cart, and then
That too.
it hits you.
Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
Different currencies, international shipping, probably some extra fees you weren't expecting. Turns out buying stuff across borders is way more complicated than it seems.
It is. It is.
And that brings us to today's deep dive.
Absolutely.
We're going to Ethiopia today.
Okay.
They're trying to simplify this whole process, make it easier for everybody with this thing called Franco-Valuta.
Mhm.
But, spoiler alert, it's causing a little bit of a stir.
Yeah, it's true. And this isn't just about, like you said, buying shoes online. This is a big deal. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how Ethiopia manages its entire foreign exchange. And that kicks up a lot of dust about how you boost trade, how you keep the money flowing, how you regulate all of that. So there's a lot of debate swirling around this. Okay, so before we get into all the really complicated parts of this, let's make sure everyone listening is on the same page.
Yeah.
What is foreign exchange, and why should we care about it?
So foreign exchange, we call it Forex sometimes. It's basically just trading one currency for another, right? It's like
When you go on a trip to Europe and
exactly.
you got to get euros or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, you got to switch it up. Now, imagine that on a huge scale, like businesses in one country needing to pay for stuff from another country.
In that country's currency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where the foreign exchange market comes in.
So it's like a giant global marketplace.
Huge, yeah.
And all these currencies are just constantly being bought and sold.
Constantly, yeah. It's churning. And, it's not like some magical thing that just figures itself out. Interest rates have an impact, what the economy is doing, even the political stuff going on. It all gets factored in, which is why getting it right, especially for a country like Ethiopia that's still developing and trying to grow its economy, it's crucial.
Got it. So where does this Franco-Valuta thing fit into everything? It sounds like something, I don't know, you'd order in a fancy cafe.
Yeah, I don't know if I go that far.
Okay.
But it does make things simpler, in a way. Think of it this way. You're that business owner. You want those Italian shoes for your shop, right? Traditionally, you'd have to go through the banking system, deal with regulations. Sometimes there are delays. It can be a whole thing. Franco-Valuta basically says, hey, let's sidestep some of that. It lets businesses use foreign currency they've got maybe from like international transfers, personal transfers, money they've held on to from exports, stuff like that, and just pay their suppliers directly.
Okay, so it's like a workaround.
Kind of, yeah.
And the Ethiopian government is okay with this.
It's a tightrope they're walking. On one hand, they want to promote trade, make it easier for these businesses, especially the small ones, to operate because, dealing with banks isn't always easy. But on the other hand, you have all this money moving around, and they're not really controlling it.
Yeah, and that sounds like it could get a little chaotic. So what's their thinking here? What are they hoping will happen?
Well, the governor of their national bank, he said the gap between the official, currency market and what they call the parallel market, that's shrunk since they did this back in July. And they're taking that as a good sign.
Okay, hold on. Parallel currency markets. What is that?
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's this whole other thing outside the official banking system, and that's what raises some eyebrows. Basically, it's where currencies get traded outside all those formal channels with all the government regulations and everything. Think of it like a street market, but for money.
Gotcha. So less official. So the government is saying this gap between the official way of doing things and the less official way is shrinking. And that's a good thing. Why?
It suggests that more foreign currency is moving through the official channels since they brought in Franco-Valuta, which they'd say means people have more confidence in their banking system now. But, of course, not everyone's buying it. Some people are saying it's way too early to be celebrating. This whole thing might be a little premature, especially with how Ethiopia's economy is doing right now.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, right? Because we've got the government saying this is great and others saying, not so fast. And our article, it really digs into those concerns, doesn't it? It talks about how this Franco-Valuta system, while it might be good for some, could also lead to some, let's just say, less than savory activities.
Oh, absolutely. It's a system, right, where you've got all this money changing hands, and it's not always under the watchful eye of the banks or the regulators. And that's how you end up with things like, illicit Forex activities.
Okay, so say more about that. What does that actually look like on the ground? What are we talking about here?
Well, think about money laundering, for starters. When transactions happen outside the formal system, the official one, it's way harder to track where the money's coming from, where it ends up, which makes it perfect for, individuals, maybe businesses even, to kind of hide where they got funds if those funds weren't exactly, acquired legally.
So, kind of like a financial shell game, you move the money around enough, no one knows where it started.
Exactly. And it's not always about dirty money either. This can also cause something called capital flight, which basically means money just starts flooding out of the country, which can really mess things up. Makes it harder for the government to manage stuff like inflation, interest rates, the whole nine yards.
So, we've got potential for shady dealings, money just vanishing. Sounds like a lot of risk for maybe not a lot of reward.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Mm.
And the article, it quotes a banker, and they were worried about what this could do to the banks, the official ones.
Yeah.
If businesses are mostly using this Franco-Valuta thing to do their foreign exchange, the banks lose out on all that hard currency.
And that's important because
Because if you don't have a healthy banking sector, the whole economy feels it. Think about it, banks. They need those deposits, the foreign currency reserves, to be able to give out loans to people, to businesses. If those reserves dry up, interest rates go up, loans get harder to come by, and that just slows everything down.
so it's a ripple effect. It's not just the big players, everyone feels it.
100%.
Hmm?
And that's where that 3% the governor mentioned comes in. Remember, the gap between how they do things officially and that parallel market. The article says it's down to 3% since they started Franco-Valuta.
Which honestly doesn't sound like that much.
You'd think so, right. But even a tiny percentage point difference, when we're talking about a whole country's foreign exchange market, that can be a ton of money. And the fact that it's still there, that gap, even after they've made these changes, it tells you something, right? A lot of the trading, it's still happening under the radar. So the government, they might not have as much control over where the money's going as they want.
It's like they're trying to walk this line. They want to help the economy grow, get rid of some of those old rules, but not if it means losing their grip on the whole financial system.
Exactly. And they've got people on both sides pushing, pulling. Some of the importers, they're saying this Franco-Valuta thing, it's a lifesaver, especially for smaller businesses that would have a hard time jumping through all the hoops the banks make you go through.
It's a tough spot to be in. How do you make a choice that works for everybody?
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and there's not an easy answer.
Mm-hmm.
The way they make this work, at least from where the government's sitting, is if they can figure out how to deal with all these concerns, right? How do you get people to use the banks, the official system, but still give businesses the wiggle room they need? That's a tough needle to thread.
So it's not enough to just like make a new rule. You got to build a whole system around it, and it has to make sense for people.
Yeah, it's about more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. This is people's livelihoods, businesses trying to make it work in a complicated world.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And their stories, the good ones, the tough ones, they show you just how important these economic policies are. It's not just theory, it's real life.
It is. And it shows you that these decisions, they have consequences, good and bad.
It really makes you think about how even a small change to policy can have a ripple effect across like a whole country's economy.
Oh, yeah, it can. And it shows you what a lot of countries are dealing with these days, not just Ethiopia, how do you let the economy do its thing grow, but also make sure things don't get out of control. You need some rules, right? It's a tough balance to strike.
Especially with globalization and everything. There's so much money flying around the world all the time. It's like governments are always playing catch up.
That's it. That's the game.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to really get into the weeds with these policies. The article, it doesn't really pick a side, is Franco-Valuta good or bad for Ethiopia? And that's because it's messy. There are good arguments on both sides.
Which is what makes this whole thing so interesting. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about understanding what you gain, what you risk, what it all means down the line.
Exactly. You got to remember, these economic policies, they're not just ideas. They affect real people every day.
Yeah.
And those effects, well, they cut both ways.
So where do we go from here? What are your final thoughts on this whole Franco-Valuta situation?
The big thing I take away from all this is you got to be watching, you got to be adjusting all the time. The Ethiopian government, they made a big move with this policy, and it's too soon to tell if it'll all work out. But if they keep an eye on things, listen to what businesses and the financial folks are saying, and don't be afraid to switch gears if they need to, they've got a shot at minimizing the risks and making this work.
It reminds you that economic policy isn't something you just set up and forget about, right?
Mhm.
It takes constant work, being flexible, being able to admit when something isn't working, and trying something else.
100%. And it shows us all that we've got to do our homework, understand these issues, because whether we see it or not, they affect every single one of us.
You know what? I couldn't agree more. Well, there you have it, everyone. A peek behind the curtain at the world of foreign exchange, economic reforms, all that good stuff. Hopefully, you're leaving our deep dive today with a better sense of just how complicated all this is and what's at stake.
Yeah, and maybe the next time you're online looking at those Italian leather shoes, you'll stop for a second, think about how those shoes got there, the whole journey.
Absolutely. Until next time, everyone, keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep diving deep.